Pronti? Shall we
Sì,
start? Okay,
sì.
welcome everyone to our giornata di studi, reading and drawing Italian queerness. My name is Luca Somigli. I'm the interim chair of the Department of Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, and Latin American Studies here at the University of Toronto, but more importantly for for the purpose of today's event, I'm also one of the founding members of the small research group called TICS, Italian Comic Studies, which organizes a number of events um, throughout the year, of which in many ways today's conference is the most important, the one that brings together more scholars and people interested in Italian comics in general. And we've been lucky over the past few years and I'm not sure if this was just happenstance or a sign of how mainstream comic studies are becoming. But over the past 4 or 5 years, we have been lucky to have a postdoctoral fellows here in the department, previously of Italian studies and now Italian, Spanish, etc., etc. We've had the fortune of having a number of postdoctoral fellows who work specifically on various aspects of Italian comics. The latest of whom was Alice Parinello, who, in addition to giving a lecture, doing a lot of interesting research while a fellow here at the University of Toronto, um, has organized this event, and I wanted to take a moment to personally thank her. She's also soon going to be leaving Toronto, so I want to thank her personally for her contribution to the department and for the work that she's doing for Italian comics, including this kind of work, which is I think very important to bringing scholars together, opening up new areas of inquiry related to the broad field of Italian comics, graphic novels, and whatnot. So yes, thank you, Alicia, for all your work. And so welcome everyone virtually. As I said, it's foggy here, so you're not missing anything by doing by connecting virtually to the rather than in person. And again, welcome, and I will then hand the virtual mic to Alicia, who will more properly introduce the conference and our keynote speaker. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you, Luca. Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. Like Luca said, today's conference title is Reading and Drawing Italian Queerness. And the way I envisioned it is an event that could showcase multiple scholars working on the seemingly marginal field of queer Italian comics, but at the same time, I don't think it's such a small field, but it's a growing and developing one, sort of following the development of graphic novel studies in Italy. Like Luca mentioned, this derives from my postdoctoral work that I've been doing at the University of Toronto, but I was really keen to engage with other scholars and to create a sort of community discussion about this topic rather than focusing only on my work. And I'm very happy to have a long list of wonderful speakers today, including our own Nicoletta Mandolini, our keynote speaker for today. So Nicoletta Mandolini is auxiliary researcher at CECS at Universidade do Minho in Portugal. She worked as FWO postdoctoral researcher at Leuven in Belgium, and she holds a PhD from University College Cork in Ireland. Founded by the Irish Research Council, her doctorate project resulted in the monograph Representations of Lethal Gender-Based Violence in Italy Between Journalism and Literature, Femminicidi Narratives, published by Routledge in 2021. Among other articles on sexist abuse in contemporary literature and media, she co-edited the volume representing gender-based violence, global perspectives for Palgrave in 2023. She's founding member of SNIF, Studying and Investigating Fumetti, coordinator of the Working Group on Visual Culture of the SOPCOM, Portuguese Society for Studies in Communication, and leader of the WG6, Exploring Genders through Science and Comics of the Coast Action Project COSMIX. She's principal investigator of the Project Gentile, Graphic Novels Against Gender Violence, and a member of the research team of the Horizon Europe project Conciliare, Confidently Changing Colonial Heritage. Nicoletta, it's a pleasure to have you here with us today. Thank you so much for accepting the invitation. I'm very excited for your presentation. Yeah, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alice. The one very excited is me. I'm very excited for this kind invitation. Thank you for the trust, first of all. And I'm also very excited to have here so many familiar faces, scholars in Italian studies, which is a field that I somehow left in the last few years, but it's always a pleasure to be back. It is also a pleasure to give the keynote address for this, I suppose, I'm sure, amazing conference, amazing symposium. This is somehow a recognition and is a way to kind of remind myself that what I do is not completely nonsense. I hope very much not to disappoint you today. I will try to share my screen. Let me know, please, if you are able to see it.
Yeah.
I'm sorry for these bars. Unfortunately, it's either this or nothing, which I prefer. So let's start. When Alice wrote me to kindly, as I said, invite me to participate in the symposium, she gave me full autonomy in the decision of the theme to be covered in the keynote address, because she's a kind person beyond being an amazing scholar. And I knew that I could not deviate much for reasons of time and of academic consistency. I tend not to multiplicate my research interests. I'm not smart enough from the quite specific interest and expertise that I have developed when it comes to the broad theme of reading and drawing Italian queerness. I'm talking here about the analysis of the transgraphic memoir, which is a topic I wrote about, specifically focusing on the work on Fumetti Brutti and Nikos Balboa. There was one, though, not insignificant problem. Being my expertise the representation of transness in contemporary comics and graphic novels, this would have only superficially, following a vulgar understanding of the trans experience as necessarily aligned with the queer discourse and community, matched with the themes of this academic event. In reality, transness and queerness, if we carefully follow the lines of trans and queer discourses, can be conceptualized as two different, if not antithetical, even though I will try to challenge these drives and tendencies. As Andrea Long-Chu stated in an interview with the Emmett Arsten Drager published on Transgender Studies Quarterly in 2019, which will serve as the theoretical backbone of this talk, I quote from Long-Chu, trans studies is the twin that queer studies ate in the womb. The womb, as usual, was feminism, unquote. Through this quasi-mythological metaphor, Long-Chu describes the relationship between two fields that emerged from the broader theoretical matrix of feminism, namely trans studies and queer studies, suggesting that the former has been subsumed by the imperative of anti-normativity and anti-binarism that queer studies successfully impose within feminist discourse. The paradox, however, is a striking one. Transness takes normativity and binarism very seriously, indeed depends on them, while queer theory has made their dismantling its foundational gesture. Where queer theory celebrates the undoing of fixed categories, the fluidity of identity, and the subversive potential of the in-between, trans experience, on the contrary, frequently reasserts the reality and significance of binary categories, the felt necessity of moving from one side to the other, of being recognized as one thing and not another, of inhabiting a gender rather than perpetually destabilizing it. In this sense, trans studies recently found itself in a theoretically untenable position, as expected to operate within a nowadays dominant, at least in academic circles, queer framework that is at its core inhospitable to some of its fundamental claims. The twin, trans studies, to return to Longchu's mythological metaphor, was first overshadowed and then consumed by queer studies theoretical movement, that towards the anti-binarism, that paradoxically, I have to say, restates though a binary and exclusionary logic. Either me and my radical revolution, says queer theory, or you with your supposedly unethical normative aspirations. The aim of this talk is to demonstrate through the Italian graphic memoir that these two poles, the desire for normative recognition and the anti-binary ethos, need not be irreconcilable. Transness and queerness, despite not being the same thing, can recover the theoretical sisterhood that a latent binary thinking has threatened. Rather than a source of impasse, their tension may become the very site of a renewed and more honest dialogue between two fields that, after all, share the same womb. It is for this reason that I believe that a focus on Italian trans graphic memoir not only fits within the scope of this symposium on reading and drawing Italian queerness, but also may bring a productive friction, I hope, to its conversation. In order to put it more academically, I have to do that. I can say that what I will try to do with this talk is to observe how the persistence of binary desires and its renegotiation in light of queer theories coexist in the Italian graphic memoir. I believe that the analysis of these fruitfully contradictory representations, and obviously, since we are talking about memoirs experiences, have the ability to soften somehow the scholarly divide between trans and queer studies. The corpus of this talk comprises 3 graphic memoirs or sets of graphic memoirs by Italian trans artists: Pila mia adolescenza trans and Anestesia by Fumetti Brutti, Barba by Alec Trenta, and Play with Fire and Transformer by Nicoletta Balboa, who is here today. Is I think my first time to kind of give a lecture or a talk with an artistic practitioner, on an artistic practitioner who is present. Please, Nikos, correct me if I'm wrong. The selection brings together both the voices of trans men and trans women, assigning relevance to the written and drawn experience of binary transgenderism and transsexuality. It is worth acknowledging that trans non-binary identities and graphic production exist and are flourishing in Italy as elsewhere, which is a fact that speaks in many ways to the productive, genuinely innovative, and progressively legitimized in some academic circles. Again, we know that the situation outside is quite different, unfortunately, force of queer discourse. However, the focus of this paper is deliberately narrower. It centers on those subjectivities that express a desire for belonging to a specific gender, transgender and transsexual subjects who seek and deserve recognition and celebration. It is this experience of wanting to be seen, to be named, and to be received either as women or men within the parameters of our, at the same time, hated and beloved gender dichotomy. And here I unveil the reasons behind the title of my keynote, that sits in most productive tension with the anti-normative imperatives of queer theory, and that this paper aims to bring to the foreground. This talk does not claim to offer a wholly new contribution to the scholarship of transgraphic memoir, but rather a systematization of a reflection that I have already developed in previous work that I had, as I have said, were dedicated to the works of Fumetti Brutti and Nicoletta Balboa. What this paper brings, in addition to the practice of systematization, is also a comparative dimension. The Italian corpus has been read alongside the analysis of a Brazilian graphic memoir dealing with binary trans experience, namely Monstrange by Lino Arruda. This comparative gesture is not merely illustrative. It responds to a broader theoretical investment in understanding comics as a transnational creative and media practice, one that circulates, resonates, and produces meaning across linguistic and cultural borders in ways that are particularly visible in a globalized media environment. An example of this is the recent translation in 2022 of Pila Minha Adolescenza Trans as P, A Minha Adolescência Trans in Brazil in Portuguese, with, I have to say, quite a big success, especially among trans artists. The dialogue that I would like to establish between the Italian and Brazilian corpora illuminates the specificities of each national context, but most of all, and most importantly, the shared challenges and strategies that trans artists deploy when they turn to the graphic memoir form to tell their stories, claim their subjectivities, and negotiate their relationship with normativity, visibility, and recognition. The decision to select a Brazilian graphic memoir as a comparative tool stems from more than one reason. It is rooted in part, of course, in my personal research trajectory and in the fact that working within a Lusophone university in Portugal has naturally led me to extend my scholarly attention to the comics production of the Lusophone cultural area. But the choice is also theoretically and empirically grounded. Trans-related narratives in graphic novel form are currently flourishing in Brazil, following dynamics of media production that bear significant resemblance to those observable in the Italian context. The extent and vitality of this phenomenon is attested by findings from a project that I recently developed with the support of the Portuguese Fundação para a Ciência e Tecnologia. The project name is Gentil, as Alice has mentioned before, Graphic Novels Against Gender Violence, and it aims at collecting and analyzing reading responses among secondary school students in the north of Portugal who are invited to engage with feminist and trans-feminist graphic novels addressing gender-based violence. In order to design the project's corpus, my research team and I conducted a mapping of graphic novels on gender-based violence produced within the Lusophone world, encompassing Portugal and Brazil. Of the 24 graphic novels identified, I have to say that 22 of them were Brazilian, which is already an interesting finding. Those addressing transphobia emerged as the single largest category, whether approaching the subject from a binary or non-binary perspective, and whether in fictional or non-fictional forms. Transphobia, in other words, proved to be the most represented forms of gender-based violence in Lusophone graphic novel production, which is a finding that supports the decision of the parallel that I will try to establish today. But let's go back to the Italian graphic memoir, which is the primary focus of our attention today. Before turning to the analysis, however, it is necessary to provide some contextual grounding, both in terms of timeline and in terms of the dynamics of media production involved. When did these graphic novels emerge in Italy, and how did they find their way to a mainstream or quasi-mainstream readership? The works at the center of this talk belong to what I define as the golden age of Italian trans comics, a period that I trace back to 2019, when Fumetti Brutti effectively came out as a trans woman by publishing her second graphic novel, P, La Mia Adolescenza Trans. The publication marked the turning point. It was at once a deeply personal act of self-disclosure and the founding gesture of an editorial movement that would go on to inspire and facilitate the publication of further graphic novels on trans experiences. Its impact was considerable. Fumetti Brutti rapidly achieved wide recognition, becoming arguably the most visible trans artist on the Italian cultural scene, not only within the world of comics. In 2020, she completed a Romanzo Esplicito trilogy with Anesthesia, in which she brought her transitioning narrative to a close by recounting her migration to northern Italy and her surgical transition. Also in 2020, Nikos Balboa's play with fire was published by Oblomov, opening the Italian graphic memoir to transmasculine experience, which is a space that was further expanded then by Alec Trenta with Barba, published by La Terza in 2022. The cultural legitimization of this trajectory was confirmed in 2023 when Balboa's Transformer, his most recent graphic novel chronicling his transition, was awarded the prize for Best Comic Book of the Year at Lucca Comics and Games, which is, as we all know, the most prestigious comics festival in Italy. It was a recognition that spoke not only to the quality of the work, but to the extent to which trans narratives had, by that point, secured a place at the very center of Italian comics culture. Within and beyond this proposed timeline, highlighting some moments of the recent history of Italian trans comics, other graphic novels on trans-related both binary and non-binary stories were published. Among these, I can mention Cinzia by Leo Ortolani, published in 2018, Sol Leone, published in 2020 by Noah Schiatti, Qui c'è tutto il mondo, published in 2020 by Cristina Licata and Filippo Paris, Fumetti Liberi dal Male, published in 2023 by Lucas Califano, H. Genitalia Panic, which will follow an interesting trajectory because it's based on comic strip that Genitalia Panic published online and then achieved the graphic novel format, following a movement that we will analyze briefly. Dietro il brillo delle stelle is another graphic novel, the most recent one that I found, published in 2025 by Francesca Calizzi and Filippo Paris. The golden age of Italian trans comics was underpinned by two significant innovations within the media landscape, and more specifically within the comics medium at both national and global level. On the one hand, the democratization of the internet and the emergence of social media platforms such as Facebook and most notably Instagram, which enabled the increased visibility of trans artists' work. These platforms offered spaces relatively free from the censorship and regulatory constraints characteristic of the traditional publishing industry. For instance, Fumetti Brutti gained widespread recognition on Instagram before being noticed by Feltrinelli Comics with very explicit vignettes and photographic self-portrait. Feltrinelli Comics, which subsequently published her first graphic novel, Romanzo Esplicito, and continued to support her publishing career. Similarly, Nikos Balboa made extensive use of social media as a means of translating into a digital platform the self-publishing practices, namely zine making and graphic diaries, that had long defined his creative trajectory, while also maintaining transnational visibility as an Italian comic artist based in France. On the other hand, the rise of the graphic novel, which, as we all know, is an often contested category, which is described by some comic scholars as merely a marketing label and by others as an autonomous, glorious, and legitimate medium, the graphic novel which facilitated autobiographical storytelling within comics through its distinctive formal affordances. Moreover, it enabled comics artists to gain access to the culturally prestigious sphere of the literary, including bookshops, critical discourse, and, as we see today, academic analysis. These two events, the advent of the graphic novel and that of social media, were far from independent. On the contrary, their interplay between the digital and the material, and between informal and institutionalized modes of production, was instrumental in fostering the emergence of trans voices. In prominent cases such as that of Fumetti Brutti, artists first built an audience online and were subsequently able to access the more formalized format of the graphic novel. This transition not only amplified their visibility, but also conferred a greater degree of cultural recognition, particularly when established publishers invited them to adapt their experiences into this format. A similar dynamic can be observed in the Brazilian trans graphic memoir. In an article published in European Comic Art, Giorgio Busirizzi and I examined the trans graphic memoirs Pequenas Felicidades Trans and Transistorizada, by Alice Pereira and Luisa Lemos, respectively, noting how the transition from online platforms to print media has enabled trans comics artists, along other marginalized creators, including women, obviously, to achieve broader visibility. In the Italian context, this transition is often facilitated by a practice of scouting, whereby publishers capitalize on the success artists achieve online. Key figures within the publishing field, such as Tito Faraci in the case of Fumetti Brutti and Igor in the case of Nikos Balboa, have played a crucial role in mediating this process. In Brazil, by contrast, this mechanism is largely replaced by crowdfunding, which trans artists, as well as women artists, use to finance the print publication of works initially shared online and then to attract the attention of publishers. Despite these contextual differences, the underlying movement remains comparable. In light of this, Giorgio and I proposed a parallel between this trajectory from the relative openness of the digital sphere to the normative structures of the publishing industry and the recurrent thematic movement within the works that we analyzed between transness and queerness. Specifically, this involves a negotiation between the desire to conform to binary gender norms and the imperative to acknowledge and embrace an inherently queer in-betweenness that characterizes both the authors, their narratives, and their publishing processes. If this structural tension between normativity and queer in-betweenness can be observed at the level of production and circulation, the social media on one side and the paper format on the other, it becomes even more pronounced within the texts themselves. It is therefore necessary to turn to the narratives in order to examine how this coexistence is articulated at the level of representation. In what follows, I will go back to the Italian context, beginning with the work of Fumetti Brutti, to explore how normative desire and anti-binary queer rhetoric are made to coexist and at the same time to collide within contemporary graphic novels, giving specific attention to the way this paradoxical process is conveyed through the construction and/or the construction of the graphic self. Fumetti Brutti is one of the most prominent and successful projects in the contemporary Italian comic scene, created in 2016 by Josefini Signorelli, a Sicilian artist based in Bologna. It began as an Instagram profile featuring autobiographical vignettes and sexually explicit self-representations. Its distinctly erotic yet feminist style quickly gained visibility, enabling the artist to move from the underground comics milieu to which she belonged into the national mainstream. After the publication of Romanzo Esplicito by Feltrinelli Comics, which is a graphic memoir addressing themes such as migration, precarity, drug use, sex work, Fumetti Brutti published in 2019, as we saw, P. La mia adolescenza trans. Promoted online as an autobiographical work, this text marked Signorelli's public coming out as a trans woman. It tells the story of a teenager whose gender dysphoria provokes a series of physical and psychological changes, social traumas, troubled sexual experiences, and the final decision to undergo an M to F transition. At the beginning of the narrative, P is approached by a man who subjects her to verbal abuse. The episode reflects a broader pattern of harassment routinely directed at subjects read as feminine in public spaces. P herself identifies this treatment as a form of sexist objectification. Mi trattano come un oggetto, they treat me as an object, she writes, thus demonstrating a clear awareness of its misogynistic nature. Yet, crucially, she does not experience this violence as exclusively negative. On the contrary, she fully embraces it, insofar as it functions as a form of gendered recognition. Being objectified and harassed confirms her legibility as a woman. As she admits smiling, ma solo così credo di valere qualcosa, but only in this way I think I'm worth something. The scene thus stages a troubling paradox in which misogynistic violence becomes a vehicle for gender affirmation. What emerges is the intensity of the desire for recognition and for belonging within normative frameworks of gender. The need to be acknowledged as a woman proves so compelling that it entails the acceptance of the very forms of objectification and violence historically imposed on women. The choices that Fumetti Brutti makes when it comes to the construction of her graphic self convey the dimension of this aspiration. The author's framing contributes to P's desired objectification, since the protagonist's body is portrayed as seen through the gaze of the man that will eventually harass her. It is drawn by Fumetti Brutti herself in a clear process of self-objectification from behind with a focus on butt and legs. In this sense, the set of panels exposes how the pursuit of normative belonging may lead the subject to internalize and legitimize its most harmful consequences. The drive for belonging is similarly articulated in Barba by Alec Trent, where the author revisits in a kind of tragicomic register his process of coming to terms with transmasculinity and gender transition. In this work, Trenta mobilizes the comics medium to represent the psychological experience of gender dysphoria, understood as the distress arising from a perceived mismatch between one's self-image and one's embodied or socially perceived identity, an experience often contrasted with that of gender euphoria. In Barba, dysphoria is specifically triggered by comparative gaze. The protagonist recognizes in other men the presence of a beard and, through this recognition, becomes acutely aware of its absence on his own body. This moment of relational comparison activates a desire for recognition again, that simultaneously produces a heightened awareness of lack. The result is a powerful sense of self-erasure, which the comic renders visually through the gradual disappearance of the protagonist's drawn figure, which was previously depicted as an androgynous transmasculine subject. This process is reinforced at the textual level through the use of verbs such as disintegrare, to disintegrate, and sgretolare, to crumble, which frame the experience in terms of fragmentation, collapse, destruction, rather than deconstruction. The word image interplay, characteristic of comics, is thus central to the representation of identity, construction, and deconstruction. We have seen, for example, how the author decides to portray himself as a male-looking character who does not unfit the male-coded environment, notwithstanding the absence of the barba, of the beard, in a clear attempt at projecting the will of belonging in the drawing page. But we also see how the drawing and textual component are crucial to the process of identity deconstruction, or better saying, destruction, imposed by the dysphoric feeling. Notably, this latter process is connoted negatively as a form of degeneration rather than transformation, thereby suggesting an implicit tension with or even rejection of celebratory queer discourse of fluidity and in-betweenness. In Nikos Balboa's work, which was characterized by an explicit queer masculine ending in Play with Fire, which was his coming out graphic novel, queerness appears to recede a bit in Transformer, which is the graphic novel that I will analyze today, giving way to a more explicit transmasculine articulation. This shift is conveyed not only at the narrative level, through the protagonist's decision to undertake medical transition, particularly hormonal therapy, but also through the pervasive and regulating presence of dysphoria. Balboa renders dysphoria graphically as a striking feminine monster with one eye, endowed with an idealized transfeminine body and an exaggeratedly perfect, fully functional penis, which becomes the object of the protagonist's persistent envy. This figure materializes at moments of vulnerability, particularly when the protagonist questions his capacity for social recognition, emotional fulfillment, and integration. Dysphoria thus operates as a visual and narrative device that constantly reasserts the protagonist's perceived inadequacy, rooted primarily in bodily characteristics that mark his transness and, in his view, undermine his legitimacy within the desired male gender category. The desire for belonging, again, emerges accordingly as a central and inescapable effect in Transformers, one that Balboa foregrounds rather than conceals. The graphic narrative form proves crucial in articulating this tension through its cross-discursive interplay of image and text. In several panels, including the one showcased in the slide, the first one on the left, the author depicts himself as possessing a normative masculine body, complete with signifiers such as a visible packer that symbolically resolve dysphoria. Yet, this visual self-representation is immediately destabilized by the accompanying textual narration, in which Balboa openly acknowledges its constructed and aspirational nature. He admits, for instance, that it does not in fact wear the boxers depicted in the image. Instead, it continues to wear feminine underwear because dysphoria prevents him from entering a men's underwear shop without experiencing intense shame and a sense of not belonging. So, in an effort to restore the form of honesty with the reader, Balboa subsequently redraws himself wearing feminine underwear. Significantly, the dysphoria figure reappears in this scene, pointing accusatorily at the protagonist's lack of masculine attributes and attire. The contrast between these two self-representations underscores the extent to which dysphoria structures both perception and self-fashioning. Ultimately, dysphoria is depicted not as a transient state, but as an omnipresent force, an affective condition rooted in the fear of not fitting in, of not being recognized, and of remaining excluded from the normative framework of gender and belonging. The one proposed by dysphoria, the figure, is a losing game. It is a game that the character Nikos cannot win. but it is a game that the protagonist needs to navigate and to accept. A game that not even the contrasting figure of Paul Preciado, the epitome of contemporary queer philosophy, who sometimes appears to reassure Nikos that he's okay as he is in the messiness of his transition, can fully erase. Queerness, as demonstrated by the Preciado character that I've just mentioned, persistently reemerges in Balboa's work, notwithstanding these desires for recognition. And although it does not ultimately override the powerful drive towards normativity, which remains evident even at the conclusion of the graphic novel, where it is projected in the imagined figure of a future and post-transition Nikos, it nonetheless functions as a crucial theoretical and aesthetic dispositive. In this capacity, queerness provides a framework through which the ongoing and resolved condition of the always transitioning subject can be represented and negotiated, enabling an engagement with the present tense experience of change rather than its idealized endpoint. Once again, the representation of the graphic self participates in the materialization of this ongoing attempt to internalize the affirmative view articulated by queer theory. A particularly illustrative example, in my opinion, is the page shown in the slide, in which Balboa returns to the technique of multiple self-portrayal already observed earlier. In this instance, the protagonist reiterates his desire for recognition while simultaneously expressing doubt about the possibility of being loved and desired in light of his present bodily anatomy, an anatomy that within a social context that is still very far from realizing Preciado's queer utopia, is perceived as misaligned with his experienced gender. While the textual component emphasizes the need to be seen and accepted as the protagonist sees himself, even in a state of undress, the visual dimension adopts a slightly different stance. Rather than adhering to the familiar rhetoric of the wrong body, which is often accompanied by a reluctance among trans authors to depict anatomical features that do not conform to their gender identity, Balboa's drawings deliberately confront and subvert this hesitation. He represents his graphic self first with a vagina, then with a visibly artificial penis, namely the soft pucker used to manage dysphoria. In a third self-portrait, the artificiality of this prosthetic becomes even more explicit, as it is rendered in the same color as a top, visually assimilating it to an item of clothing. This aesthetic strategy foregrounds what might be described in here, yes, it is this time to fully mobilize Paul Preciado as an aesthetic of the fake, an embrace of the dildo, the prosthesis, and the artificial as site of identity construction. In doing so, Balboa not only exposes the constructed nature of gendered embodiment, but also mobilizes artifice as a means of negotiating the tension between normative desire and queer reimagination. The aesthetic dispositive of queerness is not absent from Alec Trenta's Barba, which we had left with a sequence of panels where gender deconstruction and anti-binary is more clearly rejected as a viable or desirable framework. As in the case of Balboa, albeit in a more implicit form, references to queer theory and to the aesthetics of non-normative embodiment emerge in the second part of the work as a tool for coming to terms with the reality of a body in transition. This shift is particularly evident when comparing two panels, one from the first and the other from the second part of the book. In the earlier panel that you can see on the left part, the author depicts his graphic self prior to the initiation of hormonal therapy. It's beardless, yet already aligned with a normative male body, presented in an idealized and somewhat unreal nakedness that erases elements associated with the protagonist's assigned gender, for example, the breast. Here, the textual layer once again articulates a strong desire for belonging, while the visual dimension anticipates and materializes this aspiration, granting form and tangibility to what remains at this stage pre-transition an immaterial projection. In the later panel, by contrast, the protagonist is portrayed after the effects of the testosterone have become visible, with the emergence of a beard and body hair. Crucially, however, the body is now represented through aesthetic markers associated with a non-conforming transmasculine embodiment, including the presence of a binder and a large clitoris and facial hair. The accompanying text takes the form of a declaration of honesty, insisting that this is what the body actually looks like, a non-normative body that nonetheless asserts its presence and legitimacy. In this sense, queer discourse is not initially embraced in Alex Trenta's Barba, but rather gradually incorporated over the course of the transition, functioning much like in Balboa's work as a learned framework that enables the subject to negotiate the gap between aspiration and embodiment. At the same time, this incorporation coexists with an ongoing investment in normativity as the protagonist progressively constructs a life oriented toward belonging and recognition within the chosen gender, thereby reaffirming the teleological horizon that underpins the transition and transness. In the case of Fumetti Brutti, the internalization of queer theory is less explicit and does not significantly reshape the graphic representation of the body, which is maybe somehow expected by a transsex woman. Nevertheless, queerness, understood here as a gradual loosening of the protagonist's adherence to the normative gender roles imposed by the transition process, remains present as a latent discourse throughout the narrative. This dynamic is particularly evident in the opening sequence of Anesthesia, which portrays the protagonist, Iole, as she appears before the court to obtain legal recognition. The scene recalls the beginning of P, La mia adolescente trans, that we have just discussed earlier. Following the positive verdict, the lawyer remarks that Iole's success depended, at least in part, on her ability to perform according to normative standards of femininity. Iole dressed up as Turbo Troia, as her boyfriend later labels her, because following the suggestions of the lawyer. And because of this manages to gain legal recognition. Iole offers no explicit response to the lawyer. However, immediately after leaving the courtroom, she is harassed by two male figures, as she was harassed, when in P, La mia adolescente trans. This time, rather than interpreting such behavior as a form of validation, she reacts by fleeing and internally expressing anger. I don't know if you remember, but before she was smiling, in P, La mia adolescente trans. The contrast with the earlier scene in P, where misogynistic harassment was partially welcomed as a marker of belonging to womanhood, is striking. In Anesthesia, the progression of the protagonist appears to enable a shift in perspective. Iole is now able, with the transition, to distance herself from the imperative to accept objectification as a condition of recognition. In this sense, the narrative suggests that queerness, which is conceived as a critical stance toward normative gender expectations, emerges as a learned mode of self-relation, one that becomes accessible as the process of social and legal recognition progresses. As in the Italian graphic memoirs discussed above, where the desire for normativity coexists with the non-normative rhetoric of queerness, a similar dynamic can be observed in the Brazilian graphic novel that I briefly consider here for comparative purposes. In this context, queerness equally emerges as directly and paradoxically intertwined with the inherently trans process of pursuing recognition within a binary gender framework. Monstrange, by the transmasculine author Lino Arruda, published in 2021, exemplifies this configuration. As its subtitle, Experimentando Horrormoniums, Experimenting Horrormones, suggests, the work mobilizes the generic convention of horror to construct an autofictional account of the author's female-to-male hormonal transition. Arruda narrates his life from early childhood, a life that was marked by a socialization not only as a girl, but as a physically non-conforming one, due to a foot malformation diagnosed at birth that later developed into a visible lordosis. The graphic novel opens with the depiction of a coping strategy developed in response to this double experience of non-normativity. Driven by a desire for conformity, both bodily and gendered, the child imagines, in order to counter the insomnia that characterized his childhood, a large hand passing over the body and correcting its perceived imperfections. He calls it the hand of God, a mão de Deus. This fantasy of normalization encapsulates from the outset the entanglement of bodily inadequacy and gendered recognition that will structure the narrative, which will continue with the graphic representation of the bodily transformations that the protagonist undergone with the aim of adapting his body to that of the masculine gender. In the final section of the graphic novels, which is significantly titled Eu ainda fui, I still was, the protagonist, who is now in an advanced stage of his transition, visits his grandfather at the hospital as he approaches death. Unaware of the transition, the grandfather fails to recognize the person before him as a relative. Even the protagonist's attempt to prompt identification by invoking his dad's name proves ineffective. This failure produces a profound sense of disorientation in the protagonist, which is rendered visually through the dissolution of the protagonist's body, as features melt and lose coherence, making him unrecognizable. In a reversal of Alec Trenta's representation of dysphoria, where fragmentation follows the perception of lack, here bodily disintegration emerges from the impossibility of being identified with the pre-transition self. This condition is explicitly articulated in the caption, Tinha virado morta viva, I had become undead. On the concluding page, the grandfather inadvertently provides what the protagonist interprets as a form of ultimate validation. By complimenting his masculine shoes, which were significantly the only element of his attire that did not belong to his pre-transition self, because Lino wanted his grandfather to recognize him, so he decided to wear Lina's dresses. The grandfather recognizes him within a masculine framework, precisely because of the shoes, the only masculine attire, part of the attire. This moment symbolically marks the protagonist's entry into the domain of socially legible masculinity. Yet, this recognition is immediately complicated with the last panel, which depicts two pairs of shoes, presumably belonging to Lina and Lino, respectively. Here, the protagonist's voice intervenes with a caption that reads, Mas aquela herança eu não quis, but that heritage was not one I wanted. This closing gesture articulates a distinctly queer movement. The long-sought recognition with a normative masculinity is finally achieved, only to be critically distanced, though, from and symbolically contested. The narrative thus resolves not in simple assimilation, but in a reflexive questioning of the very norm that had structured the protagonist's desire for grounding the ambivalence at the heart of trans and queer process of becoming. As the comparative Brazilian case of Monstrange summarizes, the Italian trans graphic memoirs I have analyzed reveal that the pursuit of normativity on which trans studies insist and the exploration of non-normative possibilities promoted by queer studies are not mutually exclusive, but rather deeply entangled, to the point that the second never comes without the first. In other words, no deconstruction of the norm is possible without experience of a deep and persistent desire for the same. Andrea Longchu, to go back to the theoretical backbone of this talk, described the trans experience as, I quote, non-normative attempts at normativity, stating that non-normativity in the case of trans-binary subject is, I quote again from Longchu, what wanting to be normal look like, unquote. I believe that the works analyzed here invite a partial reconfiguration of this crucial insight. Rather than presenting non-normativity just as the socially visible form of a desire for the norm, these graphic narratives stage what might be described as normative attempts at non-normativity. That is, while the protagonist of the story analyzed invested in achieving recognition within normative gender frameworks, they gradually discover the possibility of inhabiting and welcoming non-normativity without disavowing this original and somehow persistent desire for the norm. Queer discourse, in this sense, is neither fully embraced from the outset nor positioned as an alternative to normativity. Rather, it is progressively integrated as a pragmatic and effective resource that allows subjects to negotiate the limits of recognition. Crucially, this negotiation does not entail a rupture with the past self. On the contrary, a continuity between past and present identities is consistently maintained, and it is here that the comics medium proves particularly significant. We saw that in Aruda, but I can mention Transformer. Transformer ends with Nico's welcoming Nicoletta, no? And saying Nicoletta ti voglio bene, or Alex Trenta also recognizes Lisa and his past self as crucial for the construction of his own identity. So through the interplay of visual and textual elements, graphic memoirs compel authors to draw, represent, and thus engage with their own prior embodiments and experiences. The act of visualizing the self across time resists the logic of erasure that often underpins a fully normative narrative transition, for grounding instead a layered and coexistent subjectivity. To conclude, I think that taken together, the Italian and Brazilian graphic novels examined here suggest that queer utopia cannot be meaningfully articulated, let alone partially realized, without first acknowledging the persistence and centrality of a vital, I would say, desire for belonging. Far from being an obstacle to queer word making, this desire emerges as a constitutive dimension of trans experience, one that structures both narrative trajectories and aesthetic choices. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Nicoletta, for the wonderful keynote. It's been great to hear about, the plethora of trans graphic novels in Italy and the, instances that you talked about between queer studies, queer theory, and trans studies. I have many, many questions. But from the audience, feel free to raise your virtual hand. I'll stop the recording for the